Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedictus mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Carissimi beloved in Christ, welcome to this broadcast Mass. We apologize for the slight delay in starting, but as they say, to err is human, to foul things up completely requires a computer. However, we are here, and today, as I said, is the Octave Day of the Feast of St. Thomas of Canterbury. Those of you who are liturgically aware will have noted, I hope, the commemoration of the Vigil of the Epiphany, but also perhaps will be concerned as to why we are not celebrating the Mass of the Vigil of the Epiphany, but instead this Octave Mass for St. Thomas, and simply put, because we are here in the United Kingdom, and particularly in the country of England and in the southeast region, and St. Thomas Becket holds a very high place in the estimation of the Church here. So it is that his Octave Day Mass supplants that of the Vigil of the Epiphany. But, as I say, the Epiphany Vigil is commemorated, and so it was that we just heard the proper last Gospel for this Mass, which is that, and will be that, of the Vigil. However, the two themes, as it were, tie in together rather nicely in one respect. That is, when we consider the actions and the motivations of King Herod that had forced Joseph to take the Holy Family into Egypt, and which the Magi had sensed, and so indeed had given him misinformation, such that angered him, and of course, unfortunately, provoked him to order then the slaughter of the Holy Innocents, whose Octave Day we remembered yesterday in Bethlehem. We reflected yesterday on the Octave of Holy Innocents, recalling our reflection from a week before on the feast day itself, to remind ourselves that it was Herod of his own volition, acting of his own free will, who chose to massacre the Holy Innocents. It had nothing to do with God, and everything to do with the exercise of Herod's free will, everything to do with Herod's concern for his crown, for his earthly kingdom. It had everything to do with his greed and with his jealousy, and indeed perhaps with his envy. Envious perhaps that a king should be proclaimed, a king should be born who had no connection with him whatsoever, was not a member of his household, was not tied to him through family of any kind. And this, of course, is what drove him, being full of himself, as we would say today, to seek the death, or to put to death, any threat that he perceived to his crown. Now we know, of course, that St. Thomas Becket of Canterbury in 1170 was facing down not quite a tyrant king like Herod, but not that far off, in the sense that that Henry II too was himself full of himself. He was jealous to assert what he perceived to be his rights, to be his royal prerogatives, and to impose them on his people, but also too on the church that was present in his realm. We know, of course, that it was this great quarrel between the Archbishop of Canterbury, then Thomas Becket, and Henry II, that eventually provoked Henry in a drunken rage to exclaim, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" And as we know, 4 knights, taking him at his word, rode off to Canterbury and slaughtered the Archbishop before the altar at Vespers. And as we reflected upon the Feast of the Holy Innocents a week ago, and as we might reflect today upon this Octave of St. Thomas, there is, of course, a comparison that can be easily drawn of both these events with our contemporary situation. We spoke on the Feast of the Holy Innocents about the genocide that is abortion, comparing it as being worse, perhaps even, than that genocide committed by Herod. Certainly numerically, the genocide of abortion is responsible for the deaths of something like 65 million babies since the late 60s. 65 million souls conceived in the mind of God, destined from all eternity to be, whose lives were tragically cut short, primarily through selfishness, through inconvenience. And let me be quick to add, as I did on that day, over a week ago, that less than 1% of those abortions had anything to do with serious medical conditions, threats to the mother's or baby's life, or rape, or sexual assault, or violence. Less than 1% of 65 million. And that 65 million is a number referring to referring to the West, shall we say, the Western Hemisphere, referring to the so-called civilized societies of the First World. That is not including, for which there are scant statistics, for other places in the world on other continents. But similarly too, regarding to make or draw a comparison from the time of Thomas of Becket and his quarrel with King Henry to our own time, is again the imposition by others, and now particularly in authority, to impose their will, to impose their ideology, to impose their way of thinking upon others. No one surely can have failed to notice the polarization that goes on in contemporary politics, a phenomena that really has only manifested itself, I'd say, in the last 5 years, a decade at most, where no longer is it possible to have reasoned and rational and logical debate or arguments, but everybody now today takes an extreme stance. Well, not only that, there have been people in the past who have taken extreme stances, and we all know what happened there. We might think of Hitler, we might think of Mussolini, we might think of Stalin, we might think of Chairman Mao, Pol Pot, and all sorts of other characters who took extreme stances politically and ideologically, much to the ruin of their nations and indeed to the genocidal death of millions. But not only, not only, but as well as, actually, indeed, I suppose it's a part of the nature of the way polarized ideologies in the extreme manifest themselves. But of course, they dehumanize the other. So that today, for example, if one is against the if one disagrees with the prevailing zeitgeist, with the contemporary politics prevalent mostly in the West today, one is traduced in all sorts of ways. One is called a bigot or a fascist, or all sorts of other derogatory terms. It is almost impossible these days, indeed, to have a logical, reasoned discussion. I'm pleased to note online that through YouTube that the senior universities in this country, but notably Oxford and Cambridge, in their students' unions are still able, just about, to have reason, to hold reasoned debates. But it's a great shame, I think, that our Parliament and indeed our media, and indeed, of course, on social media is a reflection. It is a shame that it is not possible to do so there. So that we are here in the UK facing a perplexing and confusing situation known as Brexit, where the country is literally divided, where Parliament cannot come to any kind of consensus, I think, and many are beginning to feel, that we're facing a situation where not only is the fabric of our society being torn apart, but literally our society, our identity even, as a people is being torn apart. And I don't think it's too extreme to draw the analogy between those other extremists of history in only the last century that I referred to earlier, and the attitude of some of those, or the majority of those, who seek to impose their worldview on others today. And it's been developing in a rather pernicious way, one might say, in using and usurping all sorts of institutions and cultural norms, altering language, altering words, altering the use of language and use of terms, redefining terms in all sorts of, and in a most unnatural way, by which I mean to say that terms and words have been changing in meaning and definitions, not in the usual organic way of development through use over time, as it were, but rather through the imposition of ideologies and political views. People are literally being forced and coerced into condoning or accepting or recognizing all sorts of things that are contrary to their consciences. And what does our Lord say? Woe betide those who harm consciences. And the great pity, of course, of all of this is that we are now bringing up a future generation who are born of this confusion and will continue in this confusion unless perhaps something dramatic happens to prevent it. And the only way in which that will happen is for particularly Orthodox Christians to make a stand like St. Thomas made. St. Thomas, of course, had disagreed with the findings of the conference held at Clarendon that had asserted the false prerogatives and privileges of the crown over the church. And in this, he had not much support. That is to say that Henry had garnered to himself the support not only, obviously, of his nobles and barons, who all, of course, would benefit, but also, too, of many of the bishops, then, of the church. Thomas had few allies, but nonetheless was resolute and remained steadfast in his defence of the rights and prerogatives of the church. The church, of course, holding itself to a higher authority than the king. Indeed, the church appealing to a higher authority than the king. Objectively speaking, a higher moral authority. And of course, this is largely part of the problem with the contemporary situation today. That whereas before civilization has always held itself up to higher ideals, to a higher sense of morality, instead the prevailing zeitgeist of me, myself and I, and what and self, primarily self, has replaced any appeal to a higher sense of moral authority or objective moral authority, making everything relativist and subjective to one's own perception. So that we have now an entitled generation of I want. And if I want, I must have. If I want, it is my right to have it. And so we have seen, particularly in the last decade, a rise in all sorts of privileges and prerogatives being accrued by people to themselves, about which otherwise, in fact, are false. And they have no right to. We see this even in the church, where people are claiming rights to sacraments, rights to orders, because they feel, because it's their vocation, because they have been called. And gradually there is a danger of losing the checks and balances within vocational discernment that were so have been so important and integral before, to ensure that a person's vocation to ministry is worked out between the church and the individual. It's discerned between the church with the individual, not the other way around. The only way, as we've been reflecting for the last 2 weeks now, and much longer has to be said, the only way that we can turn this around, the only way that we can right this pernicious evil in our society, this overemphasis on self, is by ourselves as Christians manifesting demonstrably our own surrender and subjugation of ourselves and our wills to God's will and purpose for our lives. It requires us, behoves us, now more than ever, to let others know that the reason why we think and behave as we do is because of our faith. All too often, perhaps, we have shied away, and indeed I would say for the last 20 years or so, Christians, particularly in public office, have shied away from mentioning their faith or from justifying their actions because of their faith. And we know that those one or two individuals who have have been castigated, have been persecuted, have been derided in this polarizing politics, as I referred to earlier. And indeed, some great and worthy personalities have been lost to our politics through such behaviour. But nonetheless, we who bear the name of Christ, we who exist because of the blood of the martyrs, should ourselves be prepared, especially at the moment when at the moment physical violence and the prospect of real martyrdom in death is not being afforded to us, though I think, and many others do, that day will soon come. Nonetheless, we can perhaps avoid that scenario coming if more of us spoke up and made a stance. And we don't have to do this in a not quite yet in a belligerent way or in a very deliberate way, but simply we can do so by voicing, giving voice to the faith, giving voice to the teachings of the apostles, giving voice, allowing our voices to be used by Christ, that the voice of the one good shepherd may resonate to our communities, to our societies. And this begins within our families. This begins within our close circle of friends. This begins within our social sphere, and even indeed in our work sphere. I suppose what I'm saying is no more, my brothers and sisters, should we go along with the notion that personal faith has nothing to do with other considerations in our lives. This separation of church and state that has somehow inflicted and manifested it and forced itself upon individuals, so that they're forced, as it were, to split themselves between their faith and their ordinary lives. That, my brothers and sisters, is where the battle is, and that's where we need as Christians to make a stance. Because our lives as Christians everything is a part of our life. It's not a case of simply being able to hive off bits and say that, oh, well, this bit I'm a Christian and in this bit I'm not. And certainly, my brothers and sisters, we don't see other faiths, adherents of other faiths, behaving in such a way. It's rather ironic that it's in a land like this, a country once a part of Christendom, known to be a Christian country, indeed, whose monarch, whose head of state, is head of an established church, it's ironic, it's ridiculous that there are laws to protect the manifestation of faith by adherents of other faiths, and none to protect those of the Christian faith. So that one wouldn't think, I hope, of questioning, for example, a Sikh wearing a turban, of a Muslim wearing a hijab, and yet Christians in the workplace are castigated for wearing a cross, or for talking about prayer or praying for others. Whereas other colleagues, Muslim colleagues for example, are given a prayer room and allowed expressly to pray 5 times a day, or allowed to fit in their work schedule around their observance of Ramadan. And yet no Christian is given or allowed to rework their schedule for the sake of fasting and abstinence in Lent, or to observe the greater Christian holidays. And in part, my brothers and sisters, that's because these minority faiths in our country have been vocal in seeking to make a stand and to manifest their faith, to live their faith, whereas Christians on the whole have been silent. And in large part, of course, that is down to the lack of shepherds, or should we say, that is down to the increase of hirelings in certain church hierarchies, that themselves have even sought to silence the voice of the one good shepherd in the public sphere, the one whom they are called to emulate. They were in no way, in any way, inheritors of the legacy of Thomas Becket. So it behoves us now, my brothers and sisters, as Christians in this land, to use the instruments, to use the tools that others have, and to use much the same arguments to reassert and to assert our own voice in the public forum, to make a stand for our faith, to claim the rights and privileges that others do in the exercise of their faith or their ideologies. So too should we. And this sounds like fighting talk, but it's not fighting talk. It's simply prudence. It's simply about turning things around. Indeed, sometimes even by using the tactics of the enemy, the tactics themselves, of course, being not necessarily perfidious. But it is time, my brothers and sisters, that we began to earn and demonstrate our inheritance, the inheritance of witnesses like the Holy Innocents, the witness of martyrs like St. Thomas Becket. That we may face down and ultimately triumph over tyrants, over Herodian tyrants, who otherwise would seek to impose by force their worldview. And we know, of course, that their worldview is selfish, is ultimately destructive. It is that prevailing worldview that is inflicting the genocide of abortion in our countries now, that is promoting a culture ultimately of death for sake of greed, for the sake of convenience. Let us seek the intercession of the Holy Innocents. Let us seek the intercession of St. Thomas, that we may be emboldened to proclaim the gospel by word as well as deed, manifesting what it means to hear and to follow the voice of the one good shepherd, and allow ourselves to be used as vessels and instruments of his will and purpose and of his voice in our families, communities, and societies today. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost.